Okay, we'll start our second panel. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yong Lee, Deputy Director of the Korea Program and an economist here at FSI. So the previous panel focused on deep-rooted historical issues, political issues that sort of led to this dispute between Japan and South Korea. What's very unique about the current situation, tension, is that the disputes of politics, of history, of public sentiment has now spilled over to business, economics, and trade. Usually economics was the buffer that actually contained some of these discords to actually maintain some of an equilibrium level, but now that levee has basically fell apart. So with that, today we have three distinguished guests. I'm very delighted to have them here. They'll be talking about this specific trade issue that's been actually unraveling, and we'll give perspectives from Japan, from South Korea, and the US. And in some sense, we'll reconvene and think about how economics, business issues, corporate relations may be a solution to actually alleviating the current tension that we're foreseeing right now. So I'll briefly just introduce their names, but please refer to the bios because they have decades worth of experience. First, we have Yukiko Fukagawa, Deputy Dean and Professor, School of Political Science and Economics from Waseda University from Tokyo. Next, we have Seokyoung Choi, former Korean ambassador to the WTO and UN in Geneva, and the former Deputy Minister for Trade. And last, we have Aiko Lane, Executive Director of the U.S.-Japan Business Council at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So without further ado, I'll invite Professor Fukagawa to the podium, and we all have slides.
We can see it here.
Well, first of all, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude for APARC Center of Stanford. And for trained by economists, still Stanford is a very established, very honorable place to have my own presentation. And I've been lucky to be being provided this opportunity. What I would like to talk today is, well, actually my main message is what is really happening between Japan and Korea is basically the emotion versus emotion kind of frictions, and it's totally nothing to do with business logic or economic relations. But so, well, insofar, we've been, there are very safe community between Japan and Korea. One is a security community, and the other one is a business community, because security has a security logic, and especially the US has been there. And a business community has also been rather free because the market logic existed. But now we are entering into a very dangerous situations because the sanctuary for the those ever-worsening relationship has been invaded by the cheap politics. So that's our issues, and we have to find something to do, some exit like here out of these situations. So maybe let me start with the emotion versus emotion structures. It's basically, in my sense, I've been working on the Korean economic development for over 35 years. And what I see, what is happening is mostly like an economic nationalism. And Korea seems to find it or interpreted it as a kind of transitional justice against Japan. So actually, Japan-Korea friction has been accelerated since 2000, when most of the Korean so-called big global businesses like Hyundai or Samsung, they had a marvelous success. And then after that, leftist government, President Moon came in to the Blue House. And the Japanese media has been saying that since Mr. Moon is such a single issue administrations dominated by North Korea dialogue, then they have no interest in economic growth or business ties, and then they started to ignore the Japan-Korea relations, such as one of the substantial supply chain global. But my observation is rather different. And it's not only the Moon administration that has started to assert their positions. It was rather the conservative regimes like Mr. Lee Myung-bak, who was the first president who's been to Tokto Islands. In our world, it's Takeshima Island. And say Japanese competitiveness is not that strong as before. So we don't have to pay much attention to Japan as a fanfare. So it started actually with the conservative regime, not the leftist regime. So, and then we have a comfort women issue under the Park regime, and then finally 1965 regime issues with President Moon. So in just watching the process of emotionalizing the whole bilateral relationship is Korea seems to be very much, from Japanese point of view at least, have a desire to prove that we are morally far superior than Japan because we have no colonization, we have no war, so we are far purer than Japan. So that sort of ideas is very important in Confucian ideal. So what's irritate Japan's people in public is Japan basically does not have this kind of value in our society. Even though we are Confucian, but we are far pragmatic in terms of everything. So the only message that we've given by rising from the rising Korean economic nationalism is that message that one of the aspects is almost looks like this. Oh, we are closer to China. So then that's really a traditional kind of East Oriental kind of order that if you are closer to China, such a big empire with the most sophisticated civilization, you have better position. And from Japanese point of view, Korea is very plagued with this kind of ideas. But we've been with the United States for after the war for decades, and then we've totally lost this kind of sense that China is now rising and the US seems to be slightly declining. So let's change our money more to the China. This kind of sentiment is quite weak. So. And also, Korea seems to be quite active in having kind of history alliance with China, and China has been manipulated this sentiment quite well, effectively. So that's one of the origins of Japan-Korea frictions in emotional structures. And since I'm trained by economists, I'm not so much knowledgeable about this kind of history or literature kind of things. But it is true that both conservative and leftist government in Korea has been seeing more economic and business value in integrations combined with their own nationalism. So integrations has started to be regarded as one of the breakthrough kind of opportunity. And it's very much based on the wishful order, graduate change in North Korea and North Korea's catch up and their political integration. No one knows what's going to happen in North, but still they tend to believe in that way. And so Park, Madam Park, now in jail, proposed the Eurasian Bridge ideas. And Mr. Moon has been pushing the ideas of belt ideas, trying to combine the North Korean resource and South Korean resource together. And Madam Park was stressing now by integration we'll be entering into G7 economic powers. Oh, okay. And Moon is more radically expressed, we are replacing Japan, surpassing Japan. So it's a kind of very radical economic sentiment, and the integration has started to be regarded as a business opportunity with a maximum opportunity with minimum cost, but no one is sure. And there is always a great ideology, since Korea is such a great people, and Japan is the country who's trying to hinder the integration because they know the talents and super genius talents of Koreans. So that's a sort of anti-Korea kind of sentiment, the basics. So it's amazing that Madam Park proposal was that if North and South Korea get together, they have per capita income of $80,000, almost triple now in Korea. And even the North is going to reach the $56,000 in 2040 to 50. So let's see. And the Belt Ideas is trying to combine with the resources and the other business opportunities like sightseeing and transportation, etc. So what would happen to Japanese sentiment is that, and actually Japan's sentiment is very divided. And most of groups like women, because of the Korean soap opera and many TV programs, they are quite a great fan of Korean culture. And the younger one was also attracted by Korean pop songs. So they are quite okay. Who's are not happy about this? Usually it's the relatively senior men who spent their peak in 1980s to 90s. So what was happening between Japan and Korea at that time is a sort of, it was the economists called the flying geese patterns of development. All of a sudden, Japan faced with the trade war with the United States, and then we've got to appreciate the yen from almost 240 yen to 100 yen just in almost within 1 year. So then we are so desperate to transplant the whole production site out of Japan to Asian countries. And the first target was Korea, Taiwan, naturally. And then it's followed by Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. And then China came. So this is called flying geese patterns of industrializations. And it was a great time for Asia to come up because it's pushed so hard the process of industrializations. So Korea has a very great confidence over these experiences. And what was chosen as the kind of friction this time is DRAM semiconductor. And that was the symbol of Korea's industrializations at that time. So from Japanese point of view, the natural response is, oh, you have now the far greater world market share, and Samsung's got such a great company, and that's true. But you have to make sure that you're really concentrated on the applied side of the technologies, and you are totally lacking in basic technologies. So this kind of response was quite strong. So, and the trade, actually, Korea has a similar sentiment, so that's why Korean government has been claiming that we've been suffering from trade imbalance for decades and decades and decades. So that means Japan is taking away all the real important value out of our countries, and that was the claim. So a Japanese sentiment is, well, that's because you were lacking in basic technologies, and that's it. So this kind of friction has been there. So carefully chosen Japanese 3 items is the items that Japan dominates the global market, not only the Korean market. I'm not sure about photoresist. Japan dominates more than 90%. Hydrogen fluoride is at least nearly 50%, and fluoride polyimide, that's 93%. So that means even though Korea is desperate to find the different resources, if Japan strengthens the export controls to Korea, it's technically very important to allocate the different sources. So in my sense, what Japan was trying to send a message by choosing these items for using the security logic is that we value the trust so important between you, and you are unsuccessful in keep maintaining the trust with the export measures. So we decided to take this kind of measures. But the Korean has interpreted as taking it as a political revenge totally. So that was the beginning of the misperception. And Japan believes that trust was lost because of the fragile rule of law since in Korea. And the Korea claimed that now, finally, the political revenge started without any grounds. And this is the emotional conflict. And another thing is that most people are very skeptical about the Korean rule of law in terms of private property protection. And Japan is really scarce in experiences by the government exploitations of private assets, except the time of American army domination after the war. So it's really crazy things for Japanese businessmen that suddenly the government came and take up and just try to sell all the private assets. So that's why we have a very threatened kind of feeling, and that's why we reacted so emotionally. So I think this is a very important thing of distrust. And probably I won't have time to talk about the Korea's economic development, etc. But there's a big dilemma for Korea. So Korean government has been desperate to narrow the trade imbalance for decades and decades, but never succeeded yet. Why? It's very simple, because Japan is trying to go up, trying to have some differentiated industrial structures with Korea. And Korean side is always trying to copy the structures. Then naturally, we are in a position on the upper stream to provide the intermediate goods and capital goods, and then the value of the final goods is lower. So that's the structural things between the bilateral countries. And another thing is Korea has always some complicated relationship with the governments and Chaebols, because the Chaebol has such a political economies with each government. So there's always a bashing of, since the democratizations in their regime, there's a bashing cycle for Chaebols. But without Chaebol's huge investment, you cannot expand the whole localization, even trying to be independent from the Japanese import. So if you try to balance the especially trade balance with Japan, you have to take in the Chaebols or ever-growing for decades. So that's a dilemma. And this time is different. I don't know. Korean government has already announced 100 items of localization in 7 years, investing heavily into subsidies to especially SME, but small companies. But I don't know whether Chaebols big companies will be able to make a huge success in cooperating with independent, smaller economies while they are trying to compete globally. So that's a kind of dilemma. So if you really Korean government wish to pursue this goal, you have to allow certain longer time. Otherwise, I think 7 years is still short enough. So another question is, well, you're okay, you can be nationalistic, but the question is, can you afford to do that while China is desperately pressuring you in terms of competitiveness? I think a Korean government has to find a good answer for this. So, but the trade dispute is totally nonsense for both Japan and Korean business people. So Japan is losing the huge market if the export controls turns to be the control. Actually, it's not. It's officially it's the change of procedure, not the controls in a numerical basis. And of course, we are not that stupid to shoot our food, so that I think in terms of supply chain, it won't affect that much. And another question for Korean side is localization. Even if it has a certain political value, you still do it, just sacrificing the major profit of Chaebols, and that's one thing. So and also, Korea has been very successful by avoiding the huge risk that lies in basic researches that was taken mostly by Japanese firms. And we've been losing a lot of profit while absorbing into our basic technologies. So you're going to do that? That's another question. And, but still, even though it's just a mere change in trade procedures, but still there's a huge uncertainty between the two parties, and that's a very stupid situations. And another thing is we've been desperately trying to seize or capture the number one market rather than only one market rather than number one market, unlike Korea, trying to differentiate ourselves in the competitions versus China or Korea. So the question is, well, now you wish to even copy this? And that's another thing. And if we fight each other, the WTO is already in a crisis, thanks to Mr. Trump, who's never believed in any kind of multilateralism. So if WTO collapses, both parties is going to suffer because we are smaller parties. Well, no matter what will happen, China has its own growing process, and US has a huge domestic market, and the trade dependencies is lower, then it is us that is going to suffer. So, and that's a bilateral stupidness, and the other thing is a global one. So the basic question is for both. We are taking such a huge economic nationalism in hardware manufacturing, but the Japanese manufacturing is switching very rapidly into Internet of Things or AI-based technologies, and a platform business and connected cars, etc. So the importance of sharing information is the far more significant things and urgent things for business community. And especially in between Japan and Korea, there's a very sophisticated accumulations of hardware manufacturing. So that way, in that sense, we need far more strategic interest in exchanging the data across the border. This kind of future issues is quite important. So finally, I just introduced the industrial positions in the global market in hardware that we are sticking to. This shows the US, and the orange one is automobile. US is lagging behind in terms of automobile. The horizontal axis is a global share, and the vertical axis is the size of the global markets. So if the bubble is bigger, that means you have huge share, sales. And if you go right and right, then that means you have a larger market share. And the US is leading in not in terms of hardware manufacturing already like an automobile, but it's shifting towards the medical care appliances rapidly. And the another thing is the US feature is the aircraft manufacturing, which is very IoT, AI-based industry now, and that's a gray one on the right. So that's the US. And what is happening in Japan? Well, Japan is so much dependent on automobile, and that's a very risky thing already. But we have, on the right-hand side, we have such a large share in terms of hybrid manufactured cars. And Japan is a case of huge, small, hidden, giant industrial structures. So if you see that the large balloon is quite limited in number, but the small size is almost galaxy kind of map, what you see in Japan. So the hidden champion is over 270 business, and that's one of the biggest among the mature economy. So what happened to Korea? Korea is actually very much dominated by Korea business, Chaebols business still. So on the right-hand side, it's a huge semiconductor businesses, but automobile is weaker and smaller. And what's left was the, in the middle is a blue one, is like probably mobile phone by Samsung, but the distribution is very different. So it's only that the industrial structures is different, and that's it, but still the crisis continues. But in politically, especially geopolitically, This means the collapse of 1965 as the first session heavily discussed. So we are going to lose some stake over the North Korean future. Even Abe government is desperate about having a historical access to a North Korean regime. And we are totally lacking in any FTA with South. That means we are totally lacking in Kaesong approach if something happens, etc. So we have to think innovationally. We have to change the perceptions of general public. So businessmen are quite okay, even economists are quite okay, but the economic nationalism just comes from the people in public, and this is SNS time. It's not the leading professional times to persuade the people in public, so we've got to do something on it. But we have to share another strategic, different type of competitions. We need some plus some rather than seesaw games types of competition. So deregulation pressure is one thing, reform competitions is another thing. Competitions for better business environment should be the very strategically important issues for us. And there should be a certain strategic agenda, like data rules for data-driven services, and the volumes and the qualities of human capital, because we are far smaller in terms of human capital if compared to China or US size. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next we have Ambassador Choi.
No worries, I'll take care of it.
Good afternoon. I'm also honored to be invited as a speaker or panelist here in this important actually seminar. I am also glad to see old friends, Ambassador Bob King and Japanese Consul General Uyama-san. We work together in Korea and Geneva. Actually, there are a lot of commonalities. Now, I would like to focus the Korea-Japan economic relations, and then trade policy of the two countries. And then I would like to analyze briefly the characteristics of the current Korea-Japan trade law, and then how we can fix it. Actually, all my personal point. Right. I just would like to, I prepared some pictures. The left upper column is the trajectory of the development path of Japan and four actually new tigers in East Asia. Just as Professor Fukagawa just mentioned, this kind of flying geese development path as Korea followed the Japan's experience, and we have reached the level of Japanese per capita income very closely recent years. And upper right side is trade volumes and items of export and import between the two countries. And down left column, this is trade imbalance existing, chronically existing between the two sides. We are importing a lot more. Actually, we are importing twice more volume than exporting to Japan for decades. That is because of peculiar Korean industry, because we are importing parts and components from Japan and then reprocessing in Korea and re-export to other countries. Therefore, when we see simply added value basis, I think Korea-Japan trade is very much balanced. No deficit, because while we are importing parts and components, most of them is re-exported to other countries. And down right side, you can see the items of deficit Korea is experiencing vis-a-vis Japan. The upper part is electronics, and the second is chemical the products. It does mean that this is one of the Korea's major exporting items. On the one hand, at the same time, this statistics reveals that Korea is heavily dependent upon Japanese, the parts and components. This is another picture. The share of Korea's export to Japan and the share of the Japanese export to Korea. In the past, Korea's export to Japan, Korea's trade to Japan was very high, but in the course of time, Korea's dependency on Japan is very much decreased, whereas Japanese Korea dependency remain unchanged. And upper right column, you can see why, because of Korea's increased trade with China. It's the relative terms of the trade volume with Japan is diminishing. But the absolute terms, actually, the bilateral trade remain nearly unchanged. And right down, this is the exchange of people. The Korean visitors to Japan dramatically increased for last couple of years. This is a new trend. Actually, Koreans are more and more Koreans are visiting Japan. It says new trends, and right column see that this is just 1 week statistics after Japan imposed export control to Korea. Most of because of the Japan boycott in Korea, there are some items which sales have been dramatically reduced. And also, the far down is a decrease of Korean visitors to Japan. Now, this trend is slightly changing nowadays, but the general direction remains unchanged so far. With that in mind, I just would like to briefly share with you the trade policy between the two countries. Actually, Korea's trade policy just copied the Japanese development model in the past. There are a lot of commonalities. The economic growth are heavily dependent on export-driven. And the two countries advocated adamantly the multilateralism because multilateral approach produce a lot of more benefits rather than unilateral or bilateralism. And both countries are vulnerable in agriculture sector, and therefore we have been cooperating very closely in Geneva whenever we are in the trade negotiations. There are also commonalities that Japan has a number of non-tariff barriers existing. We have learned good things and bad things together from Japan. Korea also operating a lot of non-tariff barriers, which are criticized by other countries. We have common concerns about US-China conflicts and then withering multilateralism. There are also heterogeneities. The both countries jumped in the bandwagon of FTA networks by the turn of new millennium. Actually, we have expanded FTA networks, the Korea and Japan. Now, both Korea and Japan just expanded FTA networks with most of all important countries. By the end of 2010s, Korea advanced a little bit more than Japan by concluding high-quality FTA with United States and European Union. But later on, Japan followed through and upgraded FTA with European Union, and also Japan joined the TPP, where United States initiated, and Korea was left behind of the TPP negotiations. And later on, after President Trump took office and he withdrew from the TPP, and Japan is taking the leadership of CPTPP, that is a TPP 11. The quality of the FTA of CPTPP is by far the highest quality, and Korea is not following that level so far. That is the difference of the two countries at the moment. And another difference is the tariff structure of the two countries. Japan has virtually no tariffs, both in manufactured goods and agricultural products. But if you see the picture, the Korea still have the high tariffs in agriculture, both in agriculture and then manufacturing sectors. This is a diagram of the both countries' participation in the regional trade agreements. And CPTPP is by far the highest quality, where Japan is leading. And South Korea is outside of TPP, CPTPP, but Korea has a bilateral FTAs with most of all the CPTPP countries except Mexico. And both Japan and Korea joined to negotiate in RCEP negotiations. RCEP is ASEAN 10 countries plus 6, China, Japan, Korea, and India, Australia, and New Zealand. But the quality of RCEP is much lower than TPP or CPTPP. Therefore, the market attraction of the CPTPP would be much lower than the higher quality FTAs. I will skip here. I just would like to discuss the contents of a US-Japan EPA when it is finally and comprehensively concluded, but the agreement was concluded, but only it was an initial agreement targeting agricultural products and then digital trade. I will just skip the slides. Now I just would like to turn on the recent Korea-Japan trade law. This is chronology. So triggered by the Korea's Supreme Court ruling last year on wartime forced labor compensation questions. This year, Japan imposed two measures. One is Japan imposed export control on 3 high-tech items to Korea, which are, these 3 items are essential for production of semiconductor and LCD, OLED displays. Specifically 3 high-tech items, and Japan excluded Korea from white list. It's kind of favored treatment. And thereafter, Korea retaliated. Actually, Korea also excluded Japan from Korean white list, and Korea also decided to withdraw from GSOMIA agreement with Japan. And the lower column in red is a future political event. Maybe both countries may make full use of this upcoming political event where the leaders can directly engage. I don't know whether either one of these events would be best utilized to address the pending questions. Now I just would like to look into the both countries' argument. Japan argues that Korea lost confidence or trust because Korea is a moving goalpost in interpreting international agreement between the two countries. That means 1965 basic agreement number 1, and maybe 2015 comfort women arrangement. Japan also mentioned that Korea has a management failure in export control regimes. But what kind of failure was not precisely described. And Japan also mentioned that there are several non-compliance cases in Korea's export control. And Korea asked what kind of non-compliance. That question was not answered. And Japan argued that Japan's measures excluding Korea from whitelist is just non-discriminatory. Actually, Japan did in accordance with international practice or rules. And this is not export prohibition, and the impact would not be significant. And Japan also, I think Japanese politicians also mentioned that Japanese actions can be easily justifiable in international rules, including WTO and export control regimes. So get Article 21, the security exceptions. I'll move over to Korea's argument. Korea argued that what kind of confidence is lost by the Korean side? Japan was talking 1965 and comfort women and also export control regimes, but actually the argument, Japan's argument is changing, and it's very much comprehensive. And Korea asked Japan to show the evidence, the smoking gun of Korea's non-compliance. But Japan did not show anything. And Korea argues that Japan's action is not compliance. It's not in full compliance with Article 21 of GATT. And Korea also argued that Japan's action is in contravention with the spirit of the cooperation in export control regimes. I am not prejudging any either party's position, but I just would like to deliver the the positions of both sides. And Korea also argues that Japan's action will only aggravate instability of global value chains, considering the complementary role of Japan and Korea in global markets. And the impact, actually, the Korea has not yet significantly suffering from this Japanese action, because actually the Japanese action was taken only a couple of months, and the export ban, export control was approved. The controlled item was approved case by cases after some time of the reviews in Japan. But still, the Korean companies have a great deal of concerns that any possible disruptions in Japanese decision not to export certain vital items to produce the semiconductors or others. And we are concerned about actually the foreign investment and also the Korea's investment to outside, while the supply of the key components or materials from Japan is not necessarily secured. There may be some disruptions depending on Japanese discretion. And we also heard that many Japanese exporters also are suffering because most of the items under control, the Korea is by far the biggest market. Therefore, Korea would not use the exported items. Actually, Japanese producers could not find out the market in the world. And actually, both countries would also suffer from the Korea-Japan, US, actually, the tripartite cooperation schemes. And the conflict between the two sides can only give advantage to China, North Korea, and Russia, actually, from the strategic point of view. I'd also like to briefly talk about Japan's export control regime. Normally, in every country who is accepting the international export control regimes, there are 4 regimes. Actually, for nuclear on the far left, and biological weapons and chemical weapons, that is the export control regime under Australian group. And delivery system, the missiles are controlled by MTCR, and conventional weapons are just controlled by Waseda arrangements. These 4 regimes are very typical international export control regimes. And Japan is faithfully complying with all the obligations of these 4 regimes. These 4 regimes we are calling regimes not because it is not legally binding. This is a voluntary participation. And Korea is also abiding by for all 4 regimes. And this is a Japanese system, export control system. Japan is by far one of the most advanced system in complying with international export control regimes. You can see down right side, if any company would breach the obligation of export control regimes, that they are subject to the punishment. It's a very harsh punishment. Korea also is operating similar system. Now, we just would like to go a little bit more in detail. Actually, what is the meaning of excluding Korea from whitelist? Actually, when the country will be listed on the whitelist, then the country can enjoy general bulk license for 3 years, and processing time is just 1 week. Then it will be changed to actually 90 days. Without knowing the final outcome of the review. It's a huge, actually, difference. And application papers are also different. Therefore, from Korean perspective, exclusion of the whitelist is apparent discrimination and mistreatment. I will just skip here. Right. I just would like to move over the final slides. Actually, between Korea and Japan, there are huge potential for cooperations. Actually, because of the industry structures, it's quite complementary. There's a lot of commonalities and complementarities. And the global trade order is changing because of unilateralism and protectionism by big countries in the world. And Korea, Japan have a number of regions to cooperate each other, and we have to protect the multilateralism altogether, and then combat actually protectionism. And again, actually currently trade issues are more and more combined with the security questions, and in Northeast Asia and in East Asia, Chinese expansion is actually inevitable, and Korea, Japan has prerogative to cooperate with each other. And then India-Pacific actually strategy by United States can only be achieved with the close cooperation of Korea and Japan. How we can sort it out? Actually, we have seen actually the development in the trade side. This is just actually spillover from historical dispute and political confrontation between the 2 sides. And actually 2 countries, they approached top-down approaches. Both president and prime minister of the 2 countries reacted actually individual basis, personally sometimes. Therefore, bottom-up approach could not address the root cause of the problem. Without addressing root cause of the problem, the trade dispute will continue. I think the trade, in order to address these problems, I think that both sides should agree to adopt a standstill, not to make additional retaliation to each other. And then both sides should agree that to set up a negotiating team instructed by President and Prime Minister directly, and then carry out the negotiation in order to achieve status quo ante. And then in order to negotiate each other, they have to withdraw all the measures taken so far from both sides. And finally, I also would like to mention about the role of the United States. I wonder whether US may miscalculate the implication or development, a serious development of the conflicts between the two sides in the early stage. And then actually they later faced with the Korea's actual withdrawal from GSOMIA, which is another interest of the United States. I think the US engagement with benign negligence or neutrality doesn't help. US engagement as a benign promoter for the tripartite cooperation is really, really required. I will stop here. Thank you.
Very much, Ambassador Choi. Next, we have Director Lane.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank Professor Shin and the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center for inviting me to come speak today. I represent the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and I've been asked to make remarks today focused on how this trade dispute impacts U.S. businesses and consumers. But before I begin, I'd like to answer the question that you might all be thinking, which is, what is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? So I often get asked this question. Many mistake the U.S. Chamber of Commerce with the U.S. Department of Commerce, and in fact, the Chamber is not part of the U.S. government. It is actually a private, powerful business advocacy group that is located in Washington, D.C. The idea for which, though, was developed by somebody in government at the time, President William Howard Taft, our 27th U.S. president. The idea of a national institution to represent the unified interests of U.S. businesses first took shape when President Taft, in a message to Congress in December 1911, wrote about the need for a central organization to promote and defend purely American interests, such as defending free enterprise and individual opportunity. 4 months later, in April 1912, President Taft's vision became a reality when a group of 700 representatives from the private sector all gathered together. Then 13 years later, in 1925, construction on the Chamber headquarters was completed on property located right across from the White House, and the U.S. business community used this location as a rallying point. So now, over 100 years later, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce represents the interests of more than 3 million businesses of all sizes, sectors, and regions. So with that, I wanted to share with you what the main concerns are for U.S. businesses in this dispute between Japan and Korea. First and foremost, for us it is about regulatory uncertainty. Whenever governments, whether at home or abroad, make non-transparent or unilateral decisions and changes in export control policies, this can lead to disruptions in the supply chains, it can lead to delays in shipments, and in this case, it could ultimately cause long-term harm to the companies that operate in Japan and Korea, depend on those countries for components, and it could also harm the workers that they employ. So with regards to supply chain disruptions, global information and communication technologies, or what we often call ICT, and manufacturing industries rely on interwoven and complex global supply chains and just-in-time inventory to efficiently source components, chemicals, technologies, materials. And these ICT products are manufactured on the basis of these global supply chains, but really, in fact, a lot of these supply chains are concentrated in East Asia. and predominantly in Japan and Korea. Japan, for instance, is extremely competitive in the semiconductor materials and equipment industries focusing on specialized chemicals. In fact, Japan is the largest supplier of crucial materials in chip production. South Korea is extremely competitive in semiconductor manufacturing, and it is the largest memory chip producer in the world. So this semiconductor industry that we're talking about right now is among the most mature, with most segments dominated by a small number of large firms. For instance, Professor Fukagawa mentioned previously, but for instance, Samsung and SK Hynix together comprise 2/3 of the world's memory chip production. And in Japan, just 3 or 4 companies produce 90% of the world's fluorinated polyamide and photoresist materials. So some of you, especially here at Stanford, may have seen those studies where they talk about the iPhone and how the iPhone, and for the US creates and retains about 85% of the value in an iPhone. So it's created here in California with R&D, some of the highest tech elements, and then the distribution, the marketing, and all of that. The most valuable components, though, of an iPhone are actually the touchscreen display, the microprocessors, the memory chips, etc. They come from a mix of US, Japanese, Korean, and Taiwanese companies, and some of these are household names for you all, like Intel, Sony, Samsung, and Foxconn. Almost none of these are manufactured in China. Apple buys the components, has them shipped to China, and then they leave China inside of an iPhone. So the bottom line is that this sector is perhaps the most internationalized of any, and Japan and Korea have big roles. Second issue is delays in shipment. So the companies that we work closely with, we have not heard of any delays in shipments yet. But what our companies are concerned about is that once stockpiles of these key chemicals run out, they will experience delays. Companies are also concerned that further escalation could potentially inflict long-term damage to this industry. So before I go into a little bit more detail on that, I want to talk a little bit about what the U.S. business community's position on all of this is. Our position is that we must ensure that trade and investment is pursued as a fundamental national interest. So I myself, having worked at the Pentagon for more than a decade of my career, I can fully appreciate the desire to place national security above all else. However, these days, governments are increasingly making the connection between economic and national security policies. And because supply chains are truly global, investment review regimes, like many of you have heard about CFIUS, and export controls on emerging and foundational technologies should really be narrowly tailored to balance governments' need to address legitimate national security concerns and promote economic growth. Furthermore, legitimate policy should restrict trade as little as possible. Practically, instructions for additional paperwork should be clear, easy to comply with. And if there are legitimate national security concerns that a country has, we would urge those countries to ensure that any changes are implemented in a transparent, predictable, and objective manner. So, which industries and firms are most affected by the dispute? So this is again from the US perspective. The 3 restricted chemicals, fluorinated polyamide, photoresist, hydrogen fluoride, are all key inputs needed for the production of semiconductors, as well as smartphone, television, and television screens. For the US, those are US companies in the global information communications technology and broader manufacturing industries that have the most potential to be impacted. But taking a step back, what does this really mean more broadly? These companies generate trillions of dollars in revenue annually and fuel economic growth and innovation around the world. Semiconductors, I don't think anybody thought much about semiconductors before, but in particular, they have had a monumental impact on our society. They make up automobiles, medical devices, computers, and smartphones. U.S. companies, particularly chip makers and those that are dependent on memory chip technologies, are concerned about the long-term impact of these policies. For example, the immediate concern is how memory chips will be affected, but then companies are also concerned that as we head into the holiday season, which is also phone buying season, whether this dispute will negatively impact U.S. companies' ability to source more complex chips. And if so, this could have a significant pricing impact for both suppliers and consumers. The other aspect of this is that the supply chains and the ability of companies to adapt to longer lead times for the duration of this dispute may be largely dependent on company-specific supply chains. So what that means is that really large companies based here in the United States may be partnering with really large Korean companies like Samsung, and Samsung may have the ability to stockpile certain Japanese chemicals. However, if there are smaller companies partnering with other smaller Korean companies, those companies may not be as fortunate. Now, it's not just the global ICT and manufacturing industries, it's actually also US consumer goods companies that have been negatively impacted. This is, and they've been impacted because of the Korea boycotting of Japanese goods in Korea. This is particularly true for Japanese-made goods, but it's also true for goods that have Japan-sourced raw materials. And according to some reports that we've seen, over 70% of the Korean population participated in the boycotts. So while it may not be readily apparent, some Japanese brands are actually owned by US parent companies, some household names that you may know well. And some American companies have production in both Japan and Korea. You may be wondering, much like I was several weeks ago, how exactly do Korean consumers know which products are made in Japan and which aren't? Well, one of our companies reported to us that what they experienced on the ground was that there were some mistaken news reports that went viral in Korea saying that there were some barcodes starting with 450 or 490 that indicated sourcing from Japan despite what was actually labeled on the package. And then these snapshots of products labels went viral in various communities and then negatively impacted these brands. The other aspect of this, of course, always, is that many Japanese firms are also customers of US firms, and stagnant sales for those Japanese companies also have a trickle-down effect for US companies. And how might US businesses and consumers be impacted in the long run? Well, further escalation could potentially inflict long-term damage to the global ICT and manufacturing industries by first driving up costs for consumers, but also making it more lucrative for other countries to supply semiconductor materials to either Korea or the US. Now, this is a longer-term competitiveness concern, as well as one that the US national security establishment is very focused on. Why? Because some countries, particularly China, sees the strategic and economic value of the semiconductor industry for its long-term growth, and it's made it clear as such in its Made in China 2025 plan that it published in 2015. They've been looking to explore ways to reduce its dependence on US technology for everything from software to chips and the tools that make them. So basically, the Korea-Japan dispute is not unfolding in a vacuum. South Korea is a key supplier to the US, and if the US is no longer able to procure components from South Korea, companies will start to look elsewhere. The medium-term concern is that countries like China may also commoditize the chip sector, similar to what we've seen in other lower value-added sectors, in a way that gives China market power and could harm US consumers and the broader industry. I'll just recall a case that we saw back in 2010 in which you may recall that there was this rare earth elements dispute. China controlled 97% of the production of rare earth minerals, such as tungsten, which is used to make many electronics. They tried to restrict their exports, and the US, the EU, and Japan argued that these restrictions were a violation of WTO trade regulations. While China said that these regulations, or that their trade controls were aimed at resource conservation and environmental protection. In 2012, the Obama administration filed a complaint or a case with the WTO, and then in 2014, the WTO ruled against China, and which led China to drop the export quotas in 2015. So you can see it took quite a while, though, right? Definitely a few years. So, meanwhile, one thing to keep in mind as we consider this ongoing trade dispute is that in the broader trade and economic context, these tensions between Japan and Korea and the related uncertainty, while modest to negligible in impact to date, actually take place against pretty dramatically slowing global trade, dipping demand, contracting manufacturing, all of which are worse in Asia than in North America. So this is not happening in a vacuum, and so we should really be more concerned about these developments as a result. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Yong.
Okay, thank you very much. So our panelists gave a great overview of the actual details regarding the trade disputes that are actually happening, some of the impacts within each country. And so before opening up to questions, I have some time. I want to, we can have an open discussion among the panelists, but the overall theme will be, where do we go from here? Okay? And in some sense, if you think about how this initiated, there were these existing tensions between these two countries, but somehow the actualities spilled over to these trade disputes. And we would imagine, hopefully imagine, that the government officials, when they were rolling out these policies, took into consideration the costs and benefits of these policies. So first, what I want to ask is, what were the expectations, first, both in Japan and South Korea, of the costs of the disputes as we were going along? And were there any unexpected ramifications, for instance, to Japan as they initiated this trade dispute, that something they didn't expect that would happen, but now they're foreseeing in their economy? And the same thing for South Korea. Is there anything that they're seeing that wasn't unexpected, but now they see unraveling? And could any of these actually move them forward to a negotiation table? So that's one. And relatedly to Director Lane, is this something sufficient enough for U.S. business to actually tell the government that, you know what, I think you guys should be involved in mitigating this issue? We'll go in this order.
I think in reality, nothing is happening at all, almost. I think even Samsung is very happy because the semiconductor industry is at the bottom now, and it started to pick up slightly, but they have enormous volume of stock. But because of it, they could adjust the price, and the price has been coming back. So as a business, they should be very happy. And we don't think this change this is actually, from our point of view, it's not the export control, but it's the change of the export procedure. So it is the Japanese side that is going to go through the a kind of red tapes, more documentation, more permissions from METIs, etc. And that's very costly for Japanese business society. So definitely Japan's business societies is not happy, but they all know that this won't bother or disrupt their supply chains to South Korea because it's a purely business. So as long as Korean administrations has been succeeded in just establishing trust in terms of compliance in METI's saying, I think in a reality, business won't be affected that much. That's the first thing. And I know that Korean government has been trying to pile up the evidences because we already entered into the WTO dispute. So you have to find some evidences that business has been disrupted. But I don't think in numerical basis it won't be that easy. And the second thing is supply chain can be disrupted, not only this kind of political dispute, but anything. And in terms of American economy is huge enough. So you've got to have far, far bigger priority in China trade dispute. It should be very much affected in the US economy as a whole. So in comparisons to that, Japan-Korea dispute remains to be quite minor. And some of the Japanese experience has shown that, in a globally competitive industries, there's always some alternative. So if Korea is desperate, you can localize the goods. And if Korea is desperate, diversifies the allocation. some other parties will have a better gain, and that's it in a business competition. So even though DRAM semiconductors is disrupted by this dispute, Micron Semiconductors is going to find the gain, and probably coming up rivals in China will have gain, and that's it. And that's the competition. So I think we don't have to nationalize the business competition into the government kind of competitions, and that's one of the important lessons that we have to think of. Okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you.
Should I?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yes, I agree that actually nothing serious happened at the moment, but many Korean companies who are involved in trade with Japan are seriously concerned because currently Japan imposes export control only 3 key items, but Korea was excluded from white list. It does mean that under any circumstances from Japanese discretion, many products, for example, on the list, on the export control list in Japan system, around 1,100 items are on the list, and they all could be subject to export controls. Therefore, for example, if anything undesirable would be developed in the seizure of Japanese companies' assets and the forced labor issues, then actually the additional action by Japanese government to strengthen export control to Korea would be quite foreseeable. Therefore, Korean companies are very much concerned about uncertainties and unpredictabilities. This is not merely changing from export control to procedures. Actually, it's changing the dynamics of trade significantly. We are talking about the trust. Japanese side is talking about the Korea's loss of trust. But while Japan does not showing the smoking guns of Korea's poor management of export controls, the Koreans just actually a growing number of Koreans are just not trusting actually Japanese actions, because strengthening export control in Japan is nothing to do with the issues of comfort women of a 1965 agreement. If it is related to export control management in Korea, then both sides should talk and sort out the problems. But there is no sincere discussions at all. It's quite unfortunate. The issues will be brought up to the WTO. Actually, WTO is now in the limbo. From December this year, the WTO appellate body would not be functioned at all. Therefore, WTO decision in the panel would not be the final, and then appellate body is in the limbo. Therefore, WTO could not sort out these problems. And on top of that, Article 21 is interpreted by countries in different ways. Particularly, United States or Russia interpreted that Article 21, for example, the essential national security can be interpreted by invoking country in all circumstances. But Japan and Korea took different positions in the past. Actually, Article 21 does not provide carte blanche, the blank check for invoking countries. Therefore, a great deal of prudence should be exercised in invoking Article 21. Therefore, the issue would be brought up to the WTO for discussions. Actually, there may be a lively discussion between the two countries in understanding the Article 21's characters. I stop here.
Thanks. I'll just make one alternative point of view to what Professor Fukagawa said earlier about supply chains. And I don't know if there's any students in the audience who are interested in learning more about this topic. The U.S. Department of Commerce, the International Trade Commission, they published a working paper on Friday about this dispute. It's about 30 pages long. It's actually pretty good. and very detailed. And but in here, what they say is that the supply chain, the semiconductor industry supply chain, is actually so highly concentrated among so few companies, and then because it's globally dispersed, any disruption to the supply chain is actually acutely felt. So for instance, in the short term, it is actually very difficult to find easily replaceable suppliers for these companies, and then in the long term, any changes are really costly to implement. They also go through some case studies or in history, and basically say that for this industry in particular, they have noticed that, so that this industry in particular, firms in this industry may, of course, try to account for one-off events, so like natural disasters or military conflicts. And this actually happened in the case of with Japan in 2011 with the Fukushima nuclear disaster and so forth, where semiconductor supply chains were actually negatively impacted because some major Japanese automakers depended exclusively on one supplier. Another example that they mentioned in which the semiconductor industry was negatively impacted was in 2014 with the Russia-Ukraine military conflict. But those were one-off events, and what the industry is very concerned about today is that this is a trade dispute between two parties that was something that could have largely been avoidable. And it wasn't something like a nuclear disaster, an earthquake, or something like that. So this is actually, according to this paper, largely uncharted territory for this industry. Now, getting back to Yong's question about what does it take for business to get involved, I can just tell you that from the U.S. business community, many U.S. businesses are kind of split on this. It really depends where you sit in the supply chain. Some companies will be able to benefit from this because they're competing with Korean chip makers. Some will be unaffected. So, for instance, Apple sources their chips exclusively from Taiwan, for instance. And then some will be negatively impacted, especially if those U.S. companies partner with Korean companies for their supplies. We have not issued a statement on this because, frankly, it is largely seen as very dicey for the business community to get involved in something like this. Everybody's pretty well aware of the historical tensions, and it's more likely to just backfire. Is our current posture. I will say, though, that there are some trade associations that have issued a letter. SIA is one of them, and along with other semiconductor industry associations. But for some associations like us, like the Chamber, that represents a very broad swath of industry, it's very difficult for us to take a singular sort of position. But what I would just say on the business community side is that it was very quiet, but late September, South Korea, Japan Economic Association and Japan-South Korea Economic Association met and made a statement about how the two governments need to have dialogue and sort this out, and pledged to cooperate more in third countries like Vietnam. So there is potential, but I think it was definitely not in front page of all the newspapers.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I would just have one quick question before opening up to the audience. So it's, okay, where do you individually, what's your perspective on whether this issue will actually be resolved in the next couple of months, because we don't have a long time frame impending that judgment by about the asset seizure. In some sense, nationalistic sentiment in both countries have led to this situation. And it seems like it's not withering. We would hope that, if the expected cost of these trade measures were high enough, that they would actually recede and then come back to the negotiating table. But based on these comments, it doesn't seem like there's substantial cost for these governments to move forward. So given that the nationalistic sentiment and the rise of nationalism that we see in these countries, what's your prospect on whether this will actually be resolved? So this is for both our Japanese and Korean panelists. And for Director Lane, what do you think, in some sense, U.S. Also has this very anti-globalistic trade agenda. Do you think that had any role in actually in what's happening within these two countries? And we'll go in.
Okay, well, reverse order. Okay, I will go first. Yeah, yeah. As I mentioned earlier, I think the perspective, the issue is not that much simple because the trade issue is entangled with fundamental historical perception issues by both countries, and also nationalistic politics in both sides also make the situation worse. I think the commitments of leaders of both countries are very important. They have to look for the future together. Otherwise, any agreement between the two sides would not be sustainable. Actually, the two sides should think about actually the future in more serious manner. And then business or academia should also work together to give pressure to the politicians of both sides to move forward for the future. Actually, nationalism is the easiest way to get popular votes in politics. But this nationalism sometimes lose sight of the future perspectives. I really hope, I sincerely hope the leaders of both countries should think about the real partnership of the two countries in the future. Again, I would like to emphasize the role of United States. U.S. Is not onlooker in Korea-Japan dispute, particularly from a strategic point of view. U.S. must think about the role U.S. should play in this complex bilateral issues. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Professor Fukagawa?
Thank you. I think still we have lots of things that we can do, especially the policy makers. They should have established a certain better accountability system because the medias are recently getting more and more like a populist. So especially in Japan, probably I think it's quite similar in the US. The media has somewhat turns to be the entertainment business. So you're constantly trying to invent some interesting, stimulating, fancy story for everybody. So the typical case was the last time WTO dispute between Japan and Korea, which was on the air pressure valve. It was quite a tiny suit, but the result, reporting the result was totally the opposite. Korean government say, oh, we totally won against Japan, so we have nothing to do against Japanese suit. And Japan has said, oh, we totally won. And finally have a good claims about Korean illegal anti-dumping things. So, but no one knows actually, the people in public never knows the very complicated legal things in the WTO, and what matters for the businessman is whether we can get a better profit or not, and that's it. So I think still, but not to just trying to preventing the medias to be another entertainment business for nationalism. I think policymakers should be very careful about explaining what is really happening. And the business bodies between Japan and Korea are very much united, actually. And it's, well, it's a kind of complicated story on the Korean side because Chaebols are under always the pressure from the government, but we are totally independent from the government, so that's a kind of different dimensions. But when Mr. Lee Jae-won of Samsung came to Japan in this dispute, the counterpart that he's been visiting were not really the manufacturers, but only the mega bank, huge bank people in Japan. Why? because he was never worried about the allocations of materials. Rather, he was worried about the loan extended by Japanese megabanks. So the business relations are very complicated, not really simple like nationalist media. And so media is another important thing. And the also political channel, as Dr. Choi correctly pointed out, things are so much politicized already. So those people who should be responsible for this development, they are politicians. So politicians should establish a certain dialogue channels between them, and that's the things. And they're in a good positions to do that. And we, as academics, I think it's not well known, and it's not reported precisely, but we've been investing a huge asset and time for educating the younger Japanese, Koreans, and Chinese students. And there is absolutely a generations who's really committed. We've got to do something for this trial relationship. Otherwise, our future will ruin. And that sort of almost environment activist in Europe kind of mentality exists. So I think still many efforts are being made. And finally, in terms of very strategic, concrete agenda, I think Koreans' participation in CPTPP is going to make another breakthrough because, well, we have to clean up all the trade imbalance or NTB kind of related issues. And in the meantime, if the WTO really collapse, we've got to do to protect our market. So maybe the convergence of KORAS, Korea-US FTA, and Japan-US THE. I don't know whether U.S. Parliament is really ratified this pact or won't be able to do it, but probably our trade bloc is getting more closest to U.S., Mexico, Canada, this kind of bloc. So that's our position is very clear. So we don't know how Korea is going to decide joining the CPTPP, and then GSOMIA will be naturally brought in the process.
Okay, thank you.
So, Yong, I think you asked about whether the administration's trade policies have influenced the recent trade actions that Japan and Korea took. I think that it certainly has played a factor in both governments' overall calculus. And I think actually it's really a troubling precedent for the U.S. business community. A couple instances, so the news cycle, especially in Washington, is very short. So the two instances that I can think of as examples about how this may have been impacted or influenced other countries is just the administration, for instance, threatened to increase tariffs on Mexico if Mexico didn't beef up its border security. That was much earlier this year. And more recently, this past August, we saw French President Macron threaten to upend the EU-Mercosur deal if the Brazilian president did not take action on the fires in the Amazon rainforest. And so I think that we are starting to see a more use of economic sticks or tools or leverage than we may have seen in the past. And the U.S. business community, and I think probably most businesses, even in Japan and Korea, would prefer stability, predictability, and that's definitely not how you would characterize the environment right now.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll open to some questions on the floor, but I wanted to give our students a first take at this. So any students here, I see, you're somewhere around there, have any questions? If so, please do introduce yourself and ask a question. Okay, don't be shy.
Quite understandable.
Okay, going once, twice, okay. Then we'll just open up to the general public. I'll go over there first. Yes.
Sorry, I'm not a student. I'm a professor, a South Korean professor who is living in Japan. So this time, this is really interesting for me, and then to observe this kind of discussion in order to tackle the issues. And then what I would like to ask to Ambassador Choi and then Yukiko Sensei, but at this time, this is quite vague. There is no win-win game. I can say this is a zero-sum game. So Ambassador Choi just mentions by now there is no significant suffering from Korean side. Are you sure about that? Or Korean government, they would not like to ignore that kind of sacrifice? In terms of Japan, what do you think, Yukiko Sensei? So as Tanaka Sensei mentioned, if we would like to go further, we have to see the sacrifice. I'm living in Kyushu area, a lot of local victims over there. And then many Korean, especially young generation, they like onsen. And that they visit there and they try to enjoy the beauty of Japan, but it just stopped. Not because of boycott Japan, as Aiko Sensei mentioned. This is boycott Abe, not boycott Japan. So that kind of a situation over there. So I would like to ask to you much more kind of objective way. What are the most victims of your country? So how we can tackle about this? Thank you.
Why don't you two first respond to this?
Yeah. Actually, I just mentioned there is no significant suffering so far. That doesn't mean that there is no suffering. There's already actually many Korean business community who are involved in the Korea-Japan business are suffering. But when Japan imposed export control against Korea, many big Korean conglomerates are concerned that maybe supply was be cut from Japan, then they could not produce the goods and to be exported to outside world. But we haven't yet reached to that point. But still, there is a potential, actually. Therefore, we are concerned. We are concerned, but the suffering itself, damage itself is not realized yet. Actually, taking this opportunity, I also would like to make comments on Professor Fukagawa on Korea's possible joining on CPTPP. Actually, the trade is an integral part of foreign policy in every country. Korea used to be interested in joining TPP negotiations beforehand, but we lost the chance. Later on, US withdrew and Japan took the leadership. And then two countries' relations getting strained more and more. And Japan initially showed that Korea's joining in the beginning, but later on, Japan lost appetite in inviting Korea to CPTPP. And from Korean side, at the same time, Korean government, current government lost appetite again. Maybe we may better wait when US may come back to either CPTPP or new type of TPP when the political circumstances would be improved or something like that. Therefore, it's a quite unfortunate situation. In my personal view, Korea must join the CPTPP, and then Japan must invite Korea to join the CPTPP. CPTPP is not merely commercial contract. This is a strategic alliance in East Asia. But both sides lose sight of the long-term perspective. It's quite unfortunate, the short-sightedness of the politicians of both countries.
I think I feel happy. So far, nothing has happened. And I do hope nothing will constantly just remain not happening. But one thing that, as a principle, what we have to prepare is that maybe the chance is getting bigger that expansions of global trade have stopped already. And unfortunately, we are going to see the collapse of the WTO, unfortunately. then we have no place to bring even these issues to. So we are in a position to support their multilateral system, and that's a very common national interest between Japan and Korea as a relatively minor trading power, unlike US or China. So that's why Japan is getting even closer to EU recently, trying to have a better coordinations of trading rules, including the data movement across the border, and also the working conditions of the foreign laborers, etc. So we've got to be something else. And my question sometimes really comes up, oh, okay, so we are almost certain to join the American League, especially we've been following the free ocean, India, Pacific kind of things in terms of security, and that's a security versions of CPTPP. If we think in that way, I don't know whether this decision is right or wrong, but we have no such a Sino-centric kind of order already. We've been with the United States for longer years in our generations at least. So I think Japan's positions is very clear. But I don't know about the Korean positions if they are seriously interested in the North Korea unification in the future, and that's natural for them. But the problem is the time span, and that is very affected by what kind of countries China is going to make. So it's a matter of time span. But again, for Japan, how long we can wait until Korea got serious about coming to CPTPP. And that's a very complicated kind of decision-making process.
Okay. Yeah, Dan?
So my understanding is, and this is addressed principally to Master Choi, and thank you very much for a very informative panel. My understanding, and I could be wrong, is that the Japanese calculation in imposing the export controls, which I think was probably a miscalculation, was that they wanted to use this to put pressure on Korean businesses to in turn have them put pressure on the Korean government. And I think to some degree it was a response to the potential seizure of assets of Japanese companies. So it was a kind of a calculated tactic on the part of the Japanese government, and with the belief that Korean businesses, were in a position, the Chaebols, but others as well, to actually have some ability to influence the policies of Blue House. That immediately after it was announced, I noticed that President Moon convened this meeting in the Blue House and engaged, and instead turned this around and used this issue to try and engage in this forms of sort of patriotic rallying of Korean businesses. So my question is, underneath the surface, because everybody sort of lined up and saluted the flag, but underneath the surface, to what degree have the Korean business community really soured on this promotion of tensions between Korea and Japan, and are putting pressure quietly behind the scenes on the Korean government to back off? I see some signs of that here and there, but I don't really have a sense of what's being said behind closed doors.
Wait, another.
So back there, just one more question.
Thank you. I'm Puneet Sharma. I'm an entrepreneur from Ireland. I'm working on a social network for leaders to resolve conflicts. Business community strategic thinking in Japan and in South Korea. This current administration in the United States is maybe another year or 4, if not sooner, the impeachment process and all that. Are they thinking things will improve after this administration? The nationalist trends, the political nationalist trends, that things will improve after this administration is replaced? Or is this going to be a longer-term lasting damage as a result of what's going on? Thank you.
I think we're pretty much at time, so I think you should respond to those 2 questions.
Actually, starting from the second question, are you just talking about the Korean politics or Japanese politics? both, yeah. We don't know actually which government would come in next elections. Actually, we have to wait and see if the Korean current ruling party would continue to rule. Actually,
It's a change of U.S.
U.S. Oh, sorry. Misunderstood. Yeah, actually, U.S. Politics is also quite volatile and it's very unpredictable. Actually, if President Trump would stay in the administration, I think this U.S. American First trade policy would continue. And even if the other side, Democrats, also took power, I think most of the protectionist measures taken by President Trump is not his own creations. Actually, it was most of them are created from Congress in legislation. Therefore, the basic the trends of America First trade policy would continue with some actually the degree of variations. The first question, whether to what extent Korean business can give pressure to Korean politics. I don't think Korean business community have power to give pressure to Korean politics. Actually, this is Japanese economic coercive measures to achieve political targets. Japan is targeting politics, actually the history issues, and then forced labor issues in order to achieve actually the Japanese interest in that areas. And business suffer actually as victims, kind of hostages to achieve this goal. Actually, when the chairman was called to Blue House right after Japan imposed export controls, actually the Korean business people have nothing to say to the government actually, because they are asking government just actually to ease the tensions between the two sides in order to continue business, nothing else.
Do you want to respond to any of that?
I think there is a common sentiment among the mature economy saying that let's make our country great again. So U.S. seems to be similar, and Abenomics has been quite similar, and Macron's France reform is quite similar. But the only thing that Japan has spent almost 2 decades already during the so-called lost decades. So in a political cycle, we are somewhat leading the process. So in the end, we came to the conclusions that if you are weaker, you've got to be with someone else. So who's going to be? So we finally decided well, there seems to be quite a big consensus that we should be the allies to the U.S. And that's a very strange decision, well, in some sense, because we have so many things to say against the U.S. government, like atomic bomb, etc. But still, we've decided. And the sentiment sometimes goes against Korea. So even we had a war, we make alliance, and we just decided not to think about war again anymore. So why don't you constantly, repeat the questions of history again and again and again, and while the so-called goals are all moving, and that is very exhausting for us. So why don't you stop and make a constructive, future-looking kind of relationship with us, like Japan-US? So this kind of sentiment is quite ruling the Japanese, especially the opinion leaders. So they might be another stressful kind of response for the Korean counterparts. And we have to stop this kind of miscommunication, and that should be the very first step and very fundamental step.
Okay. Do you have any, Director Lane, do you want to add anything?
On that note.
Okay, on that note, no. So I think we've reached to a conclusion, and we haven't solved the issue. We're still at an uncertain world, but hopefully we can remain hopeful. So please join me in thanking our panelists who've traveled quite a bit, both from the East and the West. Thank you, and Professor Shin will wrap it up for us.
Okay, so I'd like to end in some positive note. So I'd like to remind you, in 1998, actually, Kim Dae-jung of South Korea and I think Geijo Obuchi of Japan, they met to agree to improve bilateral relationship. And among other things, there are two things that they recognize. One is, okay, despite all those problems, the bilateral relationship between two countries has been quite good, except Japanese invasion and colonial rule. But other than that, if you take a long-term perspective, it's been quite good. That's one recognition. Okay, the other one, Japan and South Korea share a lot of things. They are leading democratic nations in Asia. They are allies to the United States. They share strategic interests like rising China and North Korean threats, and both are aging societies. So I think recognizing those common interests, that's very, very important. So hopefully Moon Jae-in and Abe can repeat what their previous leaders have done like 20 years ago. So hopefully that could happen. I mean, I like to be optimistic. Despite all those things, who knows? Maybe Abe and Moon Jae-in can declare something very positive for the future of of the relationship. So with that, I'd like to thank you all our panelists and also joining our event. So thank you very much.